Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We've got a great panel and our lead presenter from Mobius Consulting joining us today. We're going to be talking about maturing your processes through swift automation. For the house rules today, we have our chat box. If you have any technical questions or issues that you have, please feel free to use the navigation bar at the bottom there to log any issues, and our team in the background will assist you accordingly. We also have a Q&A box. There is going to be a panel discussion at the end of today, so please prep your questions as we go through the presentation and the demonstration. I'm sure our expert panelists will be able to answer some of those questions. We also have an anonymous option. So if you ask your questions, you can ask with your name or in an anonymous fashion. In terms of our agenda for today, we are covering our introductions. From there, I'm going to be handing over to Amanda, who's going to be taking us through a Swift summary, common practices relating to Swift and typically the maturity journey and the automation benefits. We're going to be touching quite a bit, hopefully, on the first, second, and third lines of defense in terms of the automation and the benefits thereafter. From there, we'll go on to an automation demo, an example of a Swift automation demo, and then we'll be opening it up to our panelists later on in the session today. I'm really looking forward to that part of the hour, and I really think it's going to be quite entertaining. So on to our speakers for today. We're going to have Amanda. Amanda is a senior management consultant with Mobius Consulting. She's recently located to the UK and is a lead implementer for ISO 27001, as well as lead auditor. And I've worked quite extensively with Amanda, especially around information security. She has 13 years of experience in information governance, risk, and security. So yeah, I'm really quite interested to see what she has in store in terms of our presentation. In terms of my background, I'm the CTO of Phinity Risk Solutions, and really the last sort of 20 years have been culminating in me arriving in Phinity. And my mission at the moment is really to create risk and compliance platforms that are simple and accessible for everybody within an organization. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Amanda, who will be taking us through to the next session. Thank you. Amanda, you're muted.
Thank you, Lee. We would have thought by now we wouldn't have that issue anymore. At least I put my camera on. So before we get into, I think, the crux of today's presentation, which is really around Swift automation and the benefits of that, and how that really helps the various lines of defense in running the Swift assessments on an annual basis. Before we get into that, I just wanted to take a step back and just go into a little bit of the history of Swift and kind of where it started, and touch on a little bit of the value around the framework itself. Just for those of you who maybe are not familiar with Swift, maybe it's something that you're getting involved in. You're at the start of your journey. So I think just to get everybody on the same playing field, just to take a step back and have just a look at where it started and the value around Swift. So it's a framework that was introduced in 2016. So it has been around for 8 years. And over that time, it has really matured. And it is one of the very few mandated frameworks worldwide within the financial services space. It's really a great framework, and it's had a lot of success over the last 8 years, just in terms of organizations completing the Swift assessments and attesting to their Swift compliance. And it is ultimately there to help enhance your cybersecurity defenses within your Swift environment. It's part of the Swift Customer Security Program, which again also which has been put in place by Swift to help improve your cybersecurity defenses. The independent assessment framework was introduced about 2 years ago in 2021. And this is ultimately where previously it was Swift would accept self-assessments, from the first line or from your payments platform team or from your Swift team. Since the introduction of the independent assessment framework, an independent assessment is now required. So this is kind of where we've come in over the last 2 years to help organizations provide that independent assessment. And so there's been a large uptake in terms of using third parties who have the right skills, who know the Swift framework, understand the Swift framework, but also understand the security controls within that and what that actually means. And I think in terms of the framework itself, other than providing you with the ability to attest to your level of security compliance from a Swift perspective, ultimately what it's aiming to achieve is helping organizations to secure their Swift environments, which means that you're able to have a view of who has access to that environment. How do you limit that access? So making sure that it's only accessible for roles that require that access based on their job functions, and that there is the capability of detecting and responding to any events and incidents if that were to occur. So when you look at the overarching objectives, linking it back to frameworks like ISO and NIST, Swift is almost supplementary to that or in alignment with those two frameworks. So it is something that can very easily, for the most part, fit into an organization's existing security control framework. It's not something that necessarily needs to sit in isolation. In terms of actually attesting, it is a requirement that this is done on an annual basis before the end of the year. So by end of December every year, that attestation needs to be provided through to Swift. And generally updates to the framework itself are made in July. So organizations are able to have a look at those updates and then ensure that the assessment is completed in line with any updates that are done by Swift in July. So that's just a bit of a quick history of Swift, kind of what it means. I think the key things here are that you do need to have an independent assessment, whether it's done by an external party or whether it's done by your second or third line of defense. It cannot be done by the first line. It needs to be seen as an independent assessment. It needs to be done annually, completed by the end of December. And ultimately, it is about improving your cybersecurity defenses within your Swift environment. So just from our experience, like I said, in the last 2 years, there's the requirement that this is an independent assessment. So over the last 2 years, we've been helping organizations to run their Swift assessments and providing that level of independence. But what we're seeing is that the process is not being fully leveraged, especially the output of the assessments. And so what we're hoping to help with today is to get to a point where those outputs can be fully leveraged by your first, second, and third lines of defense, and ultimately the organization as a whole. So over the last 2 years, based on our experience and what we've been seeing, is that the process is very reactive. I think a lot of the times, especially because it is a compliance requirement, it's that thing that gets done at the last minute, seen as like a bit of a tick box exercise. Let's just get it done so that we can submit our attestation. And, that's okay if the intention is just to comply and just meet those minimum requirements. But, you're spending time, money, effort, resources on this process. So I think most organizations will want to get more out of it than just being able to attest to the fact that you comply to those Swift requirements. So currently we're seeing that it is very reactive. It's very dependent on certain individuals. which then leads to affecting the continuity of assessments. So individuals the following year leave, there's no record of what was assessed, who did what, and so we can't leverage off of those previous assessment results. And that creates a lot of admin in the process every year because you're almost starting from scratch every year. Control owners are not defined. So as you kick off the assessment, you might know what needs to be assessed. You might have a skilled assessor in place, but as you start to then run with the assessment, you very quickly realize that, hang on, we actually don't know who the control owners are and who we need to speak to get the assessment completed. So that's also one of the key points, is just to know who owns which controls, who are those key stakeholders, and to ensure that that continuity is in place so that year on year, if a control owner changes or somebody leaves, there's a kind of a continuity or handover that happens to make sure that there is always that person to talk to who's going to then attest to the controls. Probably the most fundamental thing in this list is the fact that the output is not fully utilized. So like I said earlier, it is being done for the most part just to attest that we meet the SWIFT requirements, but there's a lot more that can be gained from the assessment results, where first, second, third line, your security teams, your risk functions, your compliance functions are able to leverage off of the output of the assessment. So that is not being fully utilized. And then lastly, I've somewhat mentioned it, but the continuity of assessments is not in place. And because this is something that needs to be done annually, year on year, you want to be able to leverage off of what was done the previous year. You want to leverage off of those results. What were the gaps? What have we done in terms of remediation? Who are the control owners? What evidence was provided previously? And in doing so, creating a lot of the efficiencies within the process so that when it gets to the point of actually assessing, we're not spending time, figuring all these things out, running around trying to figure out who is the control owner, who did we speak to last year, where are the working papers saved, where is the evidence saved, etc. So that's a lot of what we've sort of seen over the last 2 years, and that sparked the idea of, well, let's look at how we mature this process. How do we take away a lot of the admin intensive aspects of the process so that the responsible stakeholders can focus on what they need to, which is, your payments platform team or your SWIFT team, focusing on what the real risks and issues are from a security controls point of view, allowing them to focus on that rather than focusing on running the process itself, but focusing on getting the assessment done so that we can get to a point of knowing what the risks within our SWIFT environment are. So leading on from what we're seeing currently, that really takes us to the initial level of maturity. So in the previous slide, like I mentioned, that means it's very dependent on individuals. The process is not well defined and it's very reactive. So that's almost the current state of what we're seeing. But we can very quickly, get to a point of that optimized level of maturity if we firstly get to a point of having a well-defined process. And that's the critical success factor in terms of automation. So firstly, knowing what the process is and having that well-defined, and within that, knowing the various roles and responsibilities as part of the process across first, second, and third line of defense, and also who those control owners are and what are their responsibilities. If that is set, well-defined, it allows for the automation to happen. It allows for us to leverage off of technology solutions, which are there to help us manage the process. So again, using the technology to manage the process so that the individuals can focus on the output of the process and really make informed decisions about the risks within the Swift environment. So getting to that quantitatively managed level of maturity where the process is predictable, it's there, it works, it just runs, and that allows us to actually measure the output of the results year on year. So again, the assessment needs to be done annually. You're able to compare the results from the 1 year to the next year through that technology solution or through a Swift assessment platform, rather than, again, being reactive, running around and managing the process, and ultimately having a process that is data-driven. So the data within the platform is able to trigger the assessment at the right time, trigger a controls review with the right control owner at the right time, instead of, every year, July comes, okay, now we've got a plan for this whole assessment. That driving factor happens automatically to trigger control owners to attest and respond and provide their evidence automatically. And in terms of also being data-driven, it's about leveraging the output of the data that is then stored within a central repository in a technology solution, where that data is centrally managed, the reports are centrally managed, and the individuals are able to review those reports, have a look at the data. That's what they really want to do. That's what your second and third line want to do. Yes, they want to check evidence, etc. But you want to be able to look at the results of the assessments again to identify those risks and make informed decisions around what remediation is required and how do we improve our security controls. And then from there, we get to a point where the process is fully optimized, and we can then focus on continuous improvement and how do we make the process more efficient? How do we further improve? And how do we integrate what we're doing into the rest of the organization? So taking it to that optimized level of maturity. So ultimately, when we look at where we're going and we look at the levels of maturity that we're trying to achieve and getting to that automated level of maturity, there's a number of benefits that we can obviously gain. And this also touches on some of the challenges or the common practices that I highlighted earlier. It's almost the reverse of that. So with having a well-defined process, with having that technology solution or some level of automation in place, we're able to firstly have visibility of our security controls over time. Almost at the click of a button, you're able to see what the results of the past year's assessments have been. What does our security posture look like within the Swift environment? And we can compare that over time because we have this central repository of assessment data, of the results of the assessment. In addition to that, we're able to build in an audit trail so we know who did what, when, at what time, at what period was a control executed, and the evidence of that assessment as well is stored in the form of an audit trail to link back to when certain controls were actually run. And so through that, we're able to then focus on improvements. And that is for, your first line, giving them the ability to focus on improvements, like I said earlier, rather than managing the process. So they're able to focus on the output, focus on the risks that have been identified and addressing those risks. And then I mentioned the continuity of the assessments. And lastly, I think in doing all of this, we're creating a lot of efficiencies. So I think a lot of the time the Swift team are running this process, and as well as your second and third line, whether it's your risk team, your compliance team, or your internal auditors. They're running this process, spending a lot of time just collecting, gathering information, figuring out who to speak to. Whereas with getting to that defined level of maturity and ultimately that level of automation, we're creating a very efficient process. So instead of the team spending time on the admin of the process, they're spending time on the output and making informed decisions. And so we are saving on costs in terms of shortening the process, making the process a lot quicker, a lot more slick. And then also getting the added value of being able to focus on the risks and what remediation is required. So if we look at the 3 lines of defense in terms of roles and responsibilities and what that means from, or what Swift automation ultimately assists with across the 3 lines of defense. So if we look at the first line of defense, they are there to implement the controls within the Swift environment. They implement the controls. They obviously need to complete the assessment to obviously highlight what is in place, what is not in place, upload whatever evidence is required, and remediate gaps. But that's what their focus should be. It should be implementing controls, completing the assessment, remediating gaps. Not running around with all the admin of figuring out who to talk to, what did we do last year, etc. Again, having that centralized platform is going to enable the first line to focus on what they need to focus on. Then in the second line of defense, they are really there to obviously do that check and challenge to make sure that what your Swift team in the first line have actually done, or what they've said they have done, it can be validated, can be attested to. And really that second line is there to report on the results and highlight what the risks are and what the non-compliances are. So that for me is the key, that's the key output, because again, going back to the objectives of Swift and the framework itself, it's being defined to help you improve your cybersecurity defenses. So if we're not looking at the risks really, and we're not looking at the non-compliances, then it's a lot of wasted time and effort, other than getting the value of saying we've attested to the Swift controls. And then going into the third line of defense, again, it's also that check and challenge. This is if you are taking it into, your internal audits. And again, that depends on how your organization is structured. From a Swift perspective, as long as the assessment has been done with a level of independence, that's okay from a Swift perspective. But it might be your risk team or your compliance team that does the assessment, and that is then fed into internal audit, again, depending on how your organization is structured. But what this is doing is obviously making sure we have really robust controls that are built into the Swift environment, and also obviously making sure that we're getting to that point of knowing where the gaps are, and ultimately through the automation, we're able to have this continuous feedback loop across the lines of defense in a very slick and streamlined way. So the moment your first line of defense completes the assessment, that is fed back into the second line, or whoever is complete, or whoever is reviewing the assessment that has been done by the first line, very easily fed back into the second line of defense. They can then very easily focus on, okay, perfect. This is what first line have said is in place. This is the evidence they've provided. Is this sufficient? Is this good enough? Does it address the risk highlighted by Swift? If not, what is that residual risk? What is the non-compliance? And then how do we need to actually remediate that? So the quicker that process happens, obviously the quicker we can get to the point of remediating and closing the gap. So really through the automation, we also improving and streamlining that communication across the lines of defense. And that then leads me to our Swift automation demo. So thank you, everybody. I am done for now. I'll see you a bit later, but I'm going to hand over to Lee.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Amanda. Really appreciate that. Okay, so right, we're just going to be stepping over into the Phinity platform now for a brief demo. So let me share my screen. There we go. That is sharing accordingly. Right, so when you log into the Phinity platform, you're presented with a number of areas in terms of risk and compliance that we support organization address. As Amanda said, we're going to be focusing in on supporting organizations manage Swift. So when you log into that particular part of the platform, you're presented with a risk entity onboarding, your registry structure, which will house all of your Swift controls, your assessment management, which houses all of your assessment campaigns when you're going to be sending out controls assessments to the control owners for them to provide information and evidence of compliance, or essentially second line. It will also take you through to the check and challenge from a second line perspective. And then from an overall viewpoint, third line will then have access to validate and ensure that first and second line are actively implementing the controls as they have identified. So that will happen in the assessment management. And then finally, just from a reporting perspective, we'll dive into some of the reports. Right. So when it comes to Swift, one of the very first things that you need to do is you need to determine what your Swift architecture is. Now, Phinity has designed a decision support capability into the platform. So I'm just going to define our Swift architecture. And we'll put in a description over here. Again, you would put in the correct information to be able to ensure that you have a system that will be able to stand the test of time. We're going to have Josh, not John Doe in this particular instance. So what this is basically starting an assessment to calculate what your Swift architecture will be. So this assessment has a number of options. And again, this is actually, if you go and have a look at this Swift documentation, this is one of the first steps. And you need to answer these kinds of questions to be able to determine what your architecture output would be. So in this instance, I am going to select no to a Fin user. And you can see that the platform incorporates a skip logic. It's one of the expert system capabilities of the platform. The next question is do you own your own communication interface? And I'm going to select yes in this instance. And again, it just reduces the amount of complexity that one needs to do in order to determine what your architecture is in this particular instance. So I've now submitted the first part of an assessment that you would typically put in place. Let me just hide this quickly. Hide video panel. So we would then just, in terms of our next step, we would go into our registry. Based on our registry, we will now be able to confirm. We'll be able to confirm what our architecture is in this particular instance. So based on our first step, we've identified that we have an architecture A1 type. So based on that, we have several mandatory, I believe 25, and advisory, 10 advisory controls that would be typically implemented with an architecture A1 type. From now that we've determined that, we've determined what our controls are. The next step is to be able to actually get these controls to the control owners for them to provide their evidence, to provide information relating to the appropriateness and the effectiveness of these controls that have been implemented in within your environment. So Phinity again allows for what we refer to as a campaign. And that campaign is the ability to correlate all of the controls into a single campaign, which then can be tracked over time. Each one of those controls relating to that campaign are then housed within that single campaign. You'll be able to track and trace the completion of that campaign and each one of those controls within that. You'll have a start date and end date. You'll have automated reminders. You'll also be able to specify the types of designs around your questionnaires. If you want evidence provided and all the rest of it, the standard Swift controls does have that in place. So in this instance, what we're going to be doing is we can see that this particular control, which is the vulnerability scanning, has not been answered. So in this instance, we're actually going to send a reminder. Again, this is something that you can actually do from the Phinity platform, override the standard automated reminders that are here. So we would send out a reminder off to that particular owner. The owner will then receive an email. If they didn't respond to it, of course, they will then click on a link, and that link will then take them to this questionnaire. This is all a control owner gets to see. They don't even need to know about the whole administration, design, configuration, all that kind of stuff. They just need to see this. They then need to read and understand what their objectives are relating to this particular control. They need to understand the risk drivers and some of the statements and the context around what they need to be providing. Once they understand that, they can then provide information relating to their control. So let's just say vulnerability for general enterprise IT services. We're going to select a file of evidence relating to that particular item, which is then uploaded. And of course, we spelled vulnerability wrong. And we would then submit that particular information. So from a user perspective, it is really quite easy, simple for them to be able to answer it. So now it's second line's turn. So first line just simply needed to answer that question. Second line now needs to check and challenge. So they will get a link from the system once that assessment has been completed. Based on that, there will be a check and challenge process now. So again, from a check and challenge, a compliance level will then log into the platform, review the information that has been provided. They may even decide to download the evidence relating to that particular item. So in this, we've got some evidence, CSCF evidence that has been provided. And you would want somebody to validate this, that the evidence is correct. And as we can see, this evidence is pretty useless in terms of being able to prove out the vulnerability capability within the environment. There's no policies, procedures, or any evidence that vulnerability scanning is happening across the Swift environment. So based on that, the platform allows you to actually use it to send a notification directly back to that particular user. So this is an example of you not being happy with the evidence provided. And there will be an audit trail that is then added to this. So what is great about the Phinity platform is that you can add evidence and action as you go along. The next thing that you might want to do is, let's say you go back and forth and you identify that there is actually an issue within your vulnerability processes. And what you'll then be able to do is actually add a treatment action item relating to your vulnerabilities. So you can use the Phinity platform. You can see how it auto completes a lot of the information right through from a category of mandatory, retail banking, linking it all the way through. So I'm just going to put this in here for the 19th of April, and we'll then be able to track that particular item. If there's any actions or activities that we might want to do as well as that, so the agreed implementation plans, and maybe this is more policy related or maybe process related. New process documentation is required. You will assign it to a particular individual. We will remove Josh from the review process, and we have a start dates and end dates. So that is a item that can then be tracked beyond that. So that's your improvement. And of course, your third line can go in and validate that those actions are being treated within the timeframes that have been addressed. So let's assume for a moment that we have now completed this. We've identified that for all intents and purposes, there is room for improvement, but we are happy to close this particular item. So in this instance, we have now gotten to an outcome of compliance. We force closing it for a reason, improvement relating to process is required. So it's not a failure in terms of the actual control potentially. We're just going to be improving it in terms of our capability going forward. So that allows the first line to provide evidence, second line to provide validation, the check and challenge, as well as identifying improvements, as well as validating with first line and second line in an auditable manner to be able to, from an audit perspective, anyone can then come in and see that communication all the way through to its conclusion. So the last three steps in terms of our Swift demonstration is relating to our dashboards. So these are just some high-level dashboards. So as I mentioned, we've got our 25 mandatory controls. We've got 10 advisory. Currently, we are still waiting on 11 for that particular campaign. We've got 10 in review, and we've got 4 that have reached conclusion. We can also add in additional pie charts and or column charts, and you can use this as you so wish. We also have a full open API, which allows you to extract information, or you can also use our open API to actually add specific risk items into your risk register. One of my favorite reports is the RAG report. So this is a view in terms of that Swift controls assessment. What this is doing is taking all of those different controls that have been assessed and responded to, and presenting them to you in a red, amber, green report, where you're able to then also add risk items to a treatment process directly from this particular point as well. Again, it's not something that you have to do. You can do it from the standard check and challenge, but it is a really nice place just to get a view in terms of your aggregated risk and compliance. Finally, just in terms of our risk log, what is really great about the platform is that, again, you use this grid-based system, and you can use that to basically calculate and determine what are your treatment actions that would be related across your entire environment. So in this instance, I have filtered in on Swift, but I can also extrapolate all the way out and bring in other risk items and or audit items that would be related to any kind of treatment action within your environment. Right, that brings us to our conclusion for the demo portion of today. So I'm going to stop sharing for a few seconds and invite our panelists to please join me. Amanda, Luca, and Candace. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time. So firstly, ladies first, Candace, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and giving us a quick overview and an introduction to you and your background and your credibility around Swift, really.
Not a problem. Thank you so much, Lee. I'm Candace Jamson, and I'm a senior managing consultant from the Cape Town office at Mobius Consulting, South Africa. And I've been involved in numerous Swift independent assessments, basically from both an internal assessor as well as an external assessor for the last couple of years. So I hope that my insights can be of some value today to all of those who are attending. And then just some wider background or experience. Started out as an external auditor, then moved into internal audit, and then ultimately into risk before moving out from my corporate shell into more of a consulting space. So that's just a little bit more about me outside of the Swift space. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Candace. And Luca, over to you, if you can give us a quick intro.
Hi, everyone. I'm Luca Cotton from Investec Bank PLC in the UK. I'm a product owner and team lead in our One Payments platform. We look after multiple gateways where our organization makes payments, and Swift is one of those gateways in our stack. The Swift CSP is a very important part of our roadmap every year, and we really put a lot of effort ensuring we're compliant year on year. I've been working on Swift and other related apps for the last 5 years, and that includes the CSP element of Swift as well. Thanks, Lee.
Awesome. Luca, don't go too far. I'm going to hit you up with your first question. So I think, you know, we've been talking really around Swift and automation, and you know, we've just seen a demonstration of a potential solution. But you know, in your experience, you know, what do you feel are the immediate benefits of Swift or any kind of automation, but predominantly around Swift automation?
So, I mean, Swift CSP has really become a yearly event on our organization's roadmap. The scale of how many teams are involved in the overall architecture is so large, and it's very encompassing to organize and get all these teams on board. And they've also got their own projects and roadmaps that they need to fulfill. By automating the process, we're simply saving time and money. So we're ridding the organization of multiple meetings with loads of people attending. We have the experts. They simply given the task required of them, and they can do it in their own time. We're also creating a consistent method of how we conduct the CSP every year, which really allows us year on year to improve and make it quicker and faster.
Yeah, awesome, Luca. So, Candice, I'm going to step over to you. And again, if anyone wants to challenge any particular points, please feel free to step in. But in your experience, you know, what do you feel are the most prominent challenges organizations are facing or could be facing as they embark on a maturity journey around their Swift processes to get to an automated state?
Thanks, Lee. I think the challenge we've seen in most of our assessments is the fact that a lot of the information is sitting in people's heads. There is obviously a requirement in terms of kind of documenting or governance around putting things on paper, but ultimately you still end up with a whole bunch of key individuals across the organization who ultimately need to contribute to performing or getting all the information out to perform and complete the Swift assessments. So what we're seeing in terms of the major challenges is about kind of sharing that knowledge, having that knowledge shared on some type of a platform where people can access it, people can have visibility of it to kind of broaden or expand that knowledge past those one or two key individuals so that they don't become this one kind of key man dependency that always being relied on for these assessments. What we have seen is challenges in the past where those people have either moved roles or left the organization. There then is a huge gap and a little bit of a runaround in terms of trying to figure out what exactly are the mitigating circumstances, what are the controls, what are the detailed processes, and if you're going to be documenting that pretty thoroughly in your actual assessment, that is a great reference point in terms of looking back to previous years to glean some insights where that has necessarily been lost through people and maybe retention of staff members.
Yeah, I think Candice, you raise a great point because within large organizations there is often a lot of churn, even if it's in a department level or whatever the case may be. So that knowledge is not often retained, and I think that talks to one of the risks of not automating. So, Luca, I think this maybe comes, it ties into maybe what you were saying. So the question that I have for you is, how do you, in your role, how do you actually motivate for the investment into an automation tool? How do you go about doing it? What do you think the blockers are? And do you think there's appetite? And again, you can kind of think about it from a sort of an industry perspective in terms of appetite for automation, because we understand what the potential risks are.
Yeah, I think if you can show real benefits in how much time you save and how you're creating more time for your employees to focus on adding value through improvement recommendations, then it's a no-brainer. I know Amanda talked earlier and Kenneth talked earlier about how this is sort of a tick box exercise in many organizations. But now when you create that automation and you've got that in place and you're creating time for the key people that have actually got the knowledge then to go and improve your security status, that's really important. So I think that's where, if you can justify that, then you're going to find the budget to make the investment.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of the example I used there in around vulnerability management. Vulnerability management in most organizations typically is quite a pain because of the volume of risks, and just trying to bring that down to the Swift area and narrowing that down to the applications would be quite a challenge in any kind of organization. And it talks to what Candace was saying around people moving and you highlighting budget will be available, but you have to motivate it. You have to show how you're going to be spending it, and ultimately what the ROI will typically be. So, Amanda, a quick question for you, just in terms of meta information. So, I mean, one of the benefits of automation is essentially meta information or metadata that typically comes out of these types of automation tools. So the question that I have is how best do you think that metadata could be used in an organization to support a compliance drive around Swift and almost kind of driving that automation?
So Lee, I think in terms of the compliance drive from a Swift perspective, I think obviously, and I'll get to the metadata point now, but maybe just obviously I think the drive is there because you have to attest on an annual basis. It's a mandatory requirement, so the drive is there. In terms of leveraging off of the data that's produced as a result of the Swift assessments, I think that it's not only about feeding that information just back to Swift, but it's about feeding that information back to your security teams, back to risk, back to compliance. And so the data, in order to do that, the data itself becomes really important. And the data, in this case, being the extent to which the controls are in place and what's working and what's not working, and where those gaps are and what is being done to remediate it. So that's the data, that we're talking about from a Swift perspective. So that's the key data that is sitting in there that it shouldn't only be the Swift team or Swift themselves that are having sight of that. It's something that can be fed into various teams, and that information used larger than just within the Swift environment. It's something that can be fed back into your broader risk management and control frameworks from a security perspective, because Swift obviously is based, the Swift security framework is looking at it from a security angle. So it feeds into understanding, as much as it's focused on Swift, it feeds into understanding what your security posture is within a specific environment. So I think at the end of the day, it's a case of just being able to share that data outside of the current teams who are looking at, because it is valuable information that can be used. And I think because the process right now, or at least what we're seeing, because it is so reactive, you're so focused on the process rather than the data itself and how better to use it.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I think also just in terms of the meta information that you're also getting is you're getting real-time feedback in terms of sticky areas. So like, for example, if Luca is a control owner of 4 or 5 specific controls and he's not responding within a set period of time, you can also put in place KPIs around response times and all the rest of it. You can build that kind of thing into automation, because Swift is not you feel like doing it, it is, and this is the expectation of what you need to get out. So, and it is mandatory and it has to be done every year. And if, for example, Luca doesn't do it in a set period of time, that has a knock-on effect onto all of the other teams, second line and third line. And that kind of metadata really kind of then will support and cement why you would want to automate, because it just kind of pulls it all together. And you're not going to have a situation where one of the team members is letting the whole down. Luca, kind of a follow-on question to you, because as I mentioned, as I asked you earlier, is like, how would you motivate for automation and that kind of stuff? But how would you then integrate Swift automation into your existing tech stack, into your existing processes, into your existing teams? Because there's a bit of change management in there. There's a bit of culture stuff in there. But what, in your experience, what do you think would be the best approach to kind of bring this in?
So from a technology standpoint, I would say a SaaS solution is the best way to go. It needs to be completely independent of our internal infrastructure. But we still want the ability to integrate and map into, let's say, our email workflows or how we communicate as an organization. Because I don't expect people to go in and just go into the tool every day and not be informed, So it needs to have some sort of integration in that sense. And we really just don't want the hassle of a full-blown implementation on premise. As you know, like with all the cloud providers now, we're moving more and more towards the cloud and less towards our data centers. So it's really important that we don't have to look after any physical infrastructure on the back end.
Yeah, I get that, Luca. I think also just in terms of this particular item with the controls, I mean, Swift provides your mandatory controls that you need to provide on an annual basis. Technically you could run that within an Excel spreadsheet. So, but it ties in with additional resources and time like that. So the thought process is, as you said, take a SaaS solution that can be automated, that ties in with your emails, that has the same kind of look and feel in terms of your way of working. And that's really as complicated as it needs to be. I would probably say one other thing in terms of integration maybe is if you can bring it into some sort of aggregated dashboard, security dashboard, SOC dashboard, something along those lines. Use that meta information to bring that in. So I think that would probably be an area that might be of interest.
Yeah, and I think also the importance is around, now we're also storing our organization's data with your organization. What's the security from your aspect, like in terms of how you store that data? Is it secure? I think that's a really important question that a lot of people will ask.
Yeah, agreed. I think one other thing, just, I think also just in terms of integration potentially, and you're also talking on the storage side of things, is also just keeping a store of all of that evidence, as you said. There may be ways, and again, we have had a look at Phinity, but potentially from a technology integration perspective, one could pass that storage information directly, or that evidence directly into Investec infrastructure. So you're literally just using your workflow, your automation from a skin perspective. But again, those are the kinds of sort of nuances that you might want to just think about in terms of an implementation around automation. But I agree with you. It's SaaS, especially for these kinds of outside validation, because it just provides that. So Candace, over to you. Just in terms of, you did mention right at the beginning in terms of your introduction. So around being a risk specialist, or stepping across into being a risk specialist. So the question that I have is how do you feel, or should it be, I'll leave it up to you, Swift assessments align with your overall risk and compliance management strategy?
Thanks, Lee. I think it's obviously with Swift and a lot of other kind of compliance requirements, they stem from either industry best practice or kind of guidance in terms of what people are and what, you know, thought leadership is around how to best protect your data or your information. So in terms of it, you know, fitting into a wider kind of risk management process, what you'll end up finding is that although there might be very specific or nuanced questions within something like a Swift assessment, there are overlaps and there can be leveraged access to, you know, a visibility of what you might be seeing in terms of maturity in that specific framework, but how that might relate and overlap to other key controls that you might be monitoring. So in a previous life, was involved in almost doing a bit of almost like a CIS benchmark dashboard to the executives to surface, you know, red, amber, green in terms of the risk exposure to, you know, very core kind of, you know, detect, respond, assess methodology and specific core controls. But like you have in your one example is that vulnerability management is something which is core, and you'll find that in an ISO assessment, you'll find it in a NIST assessment, you'll find it in a Swift assessment. What you're able to do is almost kind of roll up everything. So in the Swift space, it would be a very kind of, if following a risk-based approach and it's a compliance thing, you'd be very much focused on that environment and the maturity of those specific controls in that space. But it ultimately would roll up into your wider patch management for your whole entire organization, not just in the Swift space. So I think a lot of these things are almost lots of bits and pieces and lots of different views, but ultimately that can culminate in a very good, you know, enterprise risk view of your cybersecurity or your information security. So I think it just forms part of that and gives you more ability to integrate or have that visibility of the results and how they fit into your wider kind of compliance or your wider governance maturity within an organization.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Candace. So this, in terms of our timing, we've got sort of 3 minutes left. So if anyone within our audience has a quick question, I'm happy to pose it to the panel. But I have one final question. This is to everybody, just taking into account we do have a finite amount of time, so please be succinct with your answers. So in terms of emerging trends relating to automation and also Swift, you know, where do you see the industry going? And then, you know, how do you implement essentially a technology that will maintain its level of compliance? So I'm going to start with Amanda.
Nice question, Lee. So I think in terms of emerging trends, and I'm actually going to answer it from not purely a Swift perspective, but I think what in Candace's last point that she was making now is how the controls from whether it's Swift, whether it's NIST, whether it's ISO, are very complementary and often the same. So I think that almost where I see it, or kind of a trend, is going to be how do we integrate all of these controls across, whether it's your Swift environment, you know, regardless of what environment is, but how do you pull all of that together to ultimately get to an overall security risk view across your various environments. And I think the best way to do that is going to be through a centralized platform to integrate all of that information and have the ability to have that centralized view. So I think that's a trend I see. I would love to see that happening. I mean, for me as a security professional, I would, you know, love to be able to kind of see that holistic view of an organization across the different environments, regardless of what framework you're using. What does our security posture actually look like?
Candace?
I think from my perspective, it's just automation is there to reduce kind of menial, mindless tasks. So in the Swift specifically, Swift assessment specifically, I think the trend is automate whatever you can to reduce, you know, the fact that I've got to maybe, as an assessor, set up 900 meetings, align diaries, send emails to harass people for evidence. That is what I'm seeing, like the real benefit in the Swift environment around kind of automating the process, is those mindless kind of menial tasks where you're wasting money on resources to do those kind of things when they could be focusing on actually performing the assessment or actually adding value in terms of improving on the content of recommendations.
And Luca, finally.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on what Candace said. Like as a user of the Swift CSP and somebody that attests to it, I'm being asked the same questions a lot of the time by second line, by third line, by interested parties. So that's wasting my time explaining the same concept to 3 or 4 different people. So now by having it in one place and having it automated, that's really making my life a lot easier.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Luca, Candace, and Amanda. I've brought up our contact us page. So as I mentioned, Amanda is in the UK. She's recently relocated there and is heading up Mobius Consulting UK. So if you have any questions, needs, wants, or requirements relating to maturing your Swift processes, implementing automation, please feel free to reach out to her. If you have any questions, again, about Phinity, you can reach out to me directly as well, and my contact details are there. I want to thank our panelists again for joining us, taking this time, Amanda for all of the preparation. Thank you, and have a great day further.